known as the Ladislau Amendment, was Duke Jonathan Humphreys. By this point, Hector Lombard's coalition had collapsed into bickering among themselves, meaning there was no united opposition to the bill that would restore military funding and raise fresh levies to relieve the FWLM on Irian. Facing the very real prospect that the Free Wells League was about to be overrun, many MPs turned back to Marek. Voting on the crucial legislation concluded with a tally of 213 for to 185 against. Help was on the way. It arrived just as the Lydens were about to land the killing blow. On March 19th, 5 regiments appeared in system aboard hastily chartered merchant freighters and headed for the Captain General. Their initial ferocity helped them win the Battle of Kirin River, but Steiner still controlled the rest of the planet. The Lydens were suffering from heavy attrition, but the FWLM reinforcements were poorly organised and inexperienced. However, when word reached them that other liberation efforts had reclaimed Bonaire and Tania Borealis and were now heading that way, the Archon realised that Irian was a lost cause and ordered the survivors to pull back. This was the turning point. Charles Marek and the Free Wells League had survived their darkest hour. They would soon remind their aggressors that the Eagle United was a force to be reckoned with. On July 4th, 2842, First Prince of the Federated Sons, Paul Davian, died unexpectedly of heart failure after over 40 years in office. His accomplishments and legacy are almost unparalleled. During the First Succession War, he rallied a realm teetering on the edge of oblivion and pushed their aggressor, who was but a single step from landing the killing blow on their capital, all the way back to their borders. During the Second Succession War, he had made incredible gains along the Capellan front, and time and again frustrated efforts by the Kuritan enemy to snatch away vulnerable systems. Politically, he had cemented his family's dominance over the nation in ways that none of his predecessors had managed. He had done so without creating antipathy within his government, a testament to his excellent leadership skills. Paul Davian is surely in contention for being the finest leader the Federated Sons has ever seen. Stepping into his massive shoes was his son Michael Davian. So many times in history, a strong ruler has been followed by a weak one, but Michael was a capable statesman in his own right. His priorities did differ from his father, however, and the renewed effort to create a Terran corridor as begun by Paul the previous year was put on hold while the Federated Sons transitioned. One of his chief concerns was the rapid decline in advanced technology. Already the achievements of the Star League were being talked about with reverence less than a century after its fall. Reversing that trend became Michael's pet project during his time as First Prince, and we can still see his impact on Federated Sons universities today. Little did he know that for every piece of technology he saved, Karpov's Comstar was erasing 10 more. At New Caledonia, the battle between Steiner and Kurita was into its second year. The Star League fortress Redcastle was holding strong, but the loss of their mountain airbase in October planted the seed of doubt within Colonel Tiber Hinders. The sudden defeat was so absolute, he suspected betrayal from within. Redcastle was eventually overcome in January, and his next moves were all countered immediately, confirming in his mind that they had been sold out. He ordered the Royal Guards to split up, and the unit fought as guerrillas for the next few years. In the Free Wells League, House Marek was beginning the long road to recovery. Their victory at Irian had been a decisive turning point, not just for the nation, but for the planet itself. Irian Battlemechs Unlimited may have lost more than 75% of their production lines, but the rest of the world had been thoroughly despoiled. The corporate overlords were at the center of rebuilding efforts, and the system would become an independent province under their governance later in the Second Succession War. The FWLM was on the counterattack, riding the wave that took them to Malungara and Trellisane in the second half of 2842, then on to Nokatunga, Malazan and Alula Borealis in 2843. In the Terran corner, they also made headway against the Lyrans on Akubens and Connaught, though their remaining 3 targets turned into protracted slogs. Each League invasion force was eventually driven off over the next 3 years. A personal tragedy for Captain General Charles Marek occurred on Dunne, where his son William was killed in action during the fight to liberate the system. The campaign would press on regardless, with Charles and his descendants frequently leading from the front. Leading from the front was not something that was in Michael Davian's wheelhouse. In fact, his interest in military matters was largely absent. This could have created problems, as the head of state was also the head of the armed forces. To overcome this shortcoming, he appointed his experienced uncle, Peter Davian, to the new position of Prime Marshal, bestowing on him all the authority traditionally wielded by the First Prince. A strong family bond existed between the two, so there was no fear of betrayal. Peter had essentially taken on the role his own uncle, Thomas Holder Davian, had held during Paul's administration. Michael instead focused his energies on making peace proposals to his neighbours. He understood full well that neither state would be willing to end the war at present, and neither would his own people, but local peaces allowed for some recovery and reconstruction on worlds that were on the brink of collapse. His decision to forego further aggression on the Combine border did not please everyone, and he narrowly avoided assassination by sniper in only his second year. "2843 marked the commencement of a renewed campaign against the Capellan Confederation. Championed by Duke Harlan Allison of the Grand Duchy of Oriente, La Reconquista began in March with a raid to destroy the battlemech factories on Bryant and the capture of Second Chance and Shepao. They would strengthen their position in the new year with 2 flanking attacks, one against the Andurian commonality and another into the Tikhonov commonality. The Marek militia sent to reclaim Bernardo believed that they had an easy task ahead of them, as Safe reported that Justine's grenadiers had abandoned the planet back in 2838 to reinforce Susano. In actuality, the Capellans had returned soon after and hidden their camp among the planet's polar ice caps. A whole company of light mechs were captured in a surprise attack before the Liao troops lifted off-world with their bounty. They would return to cause more mayhem, but only as a layover on their journey deep into the Free Worlds League. An R&R base on Wisconsin was their primary target, where they wiped out virtually the entire 8th Marek militia before they themselves were destroyed. In a Corward direction, Archon Marcus Steiner had been touring the front line throughout 2843, hoping to boost morale and shore up defences. A busy schedule kept him hopping from star to star, but his voyage was abandoned when he contracted a virulent strain of meningitis at Lorik. He was rushed back to the capital to undergo treatment, but while still en route, lapsed into a coma on November 24th. By the time he arrived home in February, the Estates General was in disarray. The unconscious Marcus was still notionally in charge, but he was clearly unable to perform his duties. General of the Armies Miles Kempek stepped forward in the interim to ensure the Commonwealth was adequately protected. The Tamar Pact was looking particularly vulnerable with so much focus along the Marek border. The previous year, the LCAF had hired the Tamar pikemen to defend the capital, while a few jumps away, the Antares Scorpions would form in 2844 to further secure the region. The government, meanwhile, was trying to decide who to pronounce Archon Designate. Two names rose to the forefront. The first was Marcus's brother, Claudius Steiner, an experienced commander and social charmer, but also somewhat aloof, with no strong political allies at court. His rival was Marcus's wife, Melissa Nin. While she had many friends among the nobility, she also lacked political acumen. Crucially though, there was a power bloc within the Estates General, led by Speaker of the Assembly Harlan Dinesen, that felt they could more easily influence her and thus exert greater control over the Commonwealth. This stalemate at the Triad allowed for the Free Wells League to recover another 3 systems, including the hotly contested world of Bella, over which half a dozen battles had been fought since the fall of the Star League. At the height of the leadership debate that raged throughout 2844, the Estates General received a missive from Claudius himself that would send shockwaves across Tharkad. Harlan was able to use Steiner's words against him to galvanize enough representatives into supporting his candidate. In December, Melissa Nin narrowly came out ahead to be named the first non-Steiner Archon in over 4 centuries. Her position was confirmed on March 13, 2845, when Marcus Steiner passed away after 16 months in a coma. Unfortunately, she proved as weak-willed as some had feared and others had hoped for. Dinesen and his supporters reveled in their newfound power while neglecting the defense of the realm. Their disinterest in running the war for the Commonwealth eventually forced Claudius's hand. He arrived on August 20th with the intention of deposing his sister-in-law. A brief mech battle between 2 regiments of the Lyran Guards, Steiner's 2nd and Nin's 3rd, saw Claudius the victor. Most of the Estates General now looked forward to a return to normality. They were quickly disabused of that notion by Steiner's harsh justice, executing Melissa Nin and Harlan Dinesen for treason the next day. But it was the new Archon's second act that left them truly astonished. Claudius disbanded the Estates General indefinitely. Over the last few years, the Prime Marshal of the AFFS had managed to more or less re-establish the Federated Sun's vital Terran corridor. They were only blocked from completing the route when Liao secured Fomalhaut across that path. However, this was not achieved without losses elsewhere. Peter Davian was essentially fighting with one arm tied behind his back, as his nephew tried his best to de-escalate the conflict. It was a noble goal, but one that would prove costly. Unable to launch cross-border raids to unsettle the DCMS, Kurita exploited their inaction by driving their forces onwards into the Draconis March. For the second time in his short reign, First Prince Michael Davian was the target of an assassination attempt in 2845. His uncle Peter had just led the AFFS to victory at Avigate and Sadar along the Cyan-St. Ives commonality border, but Michael again requested that he scale back his aggression in light of his expanded efforts to reach a peace with Liao. However, Chancellor Lorelli had continually rebuffed his proposal so far, still bitter that her own mother's efforts had been spat on by his predecessor. The Peace Prince, as Michael had become known, was not acting altogether altruistically. In fact, it's clear that Davian felt very self-important, perhaps even delusionally so. His terms repeatedly called for Kurita and Liao to recognize him as the First Lord of a reformed Star League. Such an incredibly out-of-touch demand would have been rejected out of hand, likely sabotaging any chances of a lasting peace from being established. The Free Wells League counteroffensive was in full swing by 2845. They fully exploited the political instability within the Lyran Commonwealth to wrestle back control of 7 worlds, much of the heavy lifting done by their two newest mercenary regiments, Landers Lancers and Reds Grenadiers. La Reconquista succeeded in taking another 6 systems from the Capellans. While the Confederation was definitely on the back foot, they made the Free Worlds League pay a high price for every planet. Orensen was one of the bloodiest battles of the war. Oriente's advance was thrown into disarray when Liao struck back at New Delos. On October 2nd, Duke Harlan Allison, one of the finest mech warriors of his generation with over 127 kills to his name, was killed in action. But this was just the first tragedy to befall the ruling family of Oriente that month, as 2 days later, on October 4th, his brother Kendall Allison was assassinated on Atreus. It's unclear whether the two events are connected. Word of the Duke's death had not even reached the capital when Kendall was shot. We don't know the exact details of the New Delos raid, but unless there was a convoluted plot to ensure Harlan did not survive the battle, it seems the timing was coincidence. What we do know is that the Marquis's wife refused to serve as regent, foregoing her twin daughter's birthright on their behalf. It's possible that she was under pressure from enemies of House Marek, looking to rob the Captain General of support in Parliament. The calls to raise Blair Hallis, a mech warrior from the Ducal Guard, to House Allison's position are also somewhat suspect. By all accounts, he was apolitical, someone who would either take little part in affairs of state or could be manipulated by those around him. If all this was an elaborate scheme to undermine the Captain General, the great irony is that it was all ultimately futile. Blair's grandson would later marry one of Kendall's daughters, uniting the two families, and House Hallis has been a stalwart of Marek support in Parliament ever since. Early in 2846, Prime Marshal Peter Davian's limited campaign against the Capellans succeeded in taking Cotocalo, but aside from a deep raid onto Carver 5 to strike at Blandford's Grenadiers, this was as far as Michael allowed the AWFS to advance. A second failed bomb hit in successive years perhaps finally snapped the First Prince out of his fantasy and made him take notice that the armed forces of the Federated Suns were on the verge of mutiny. It might already have been too late to stop it. In May, Peter Davian was approached by a cabal of high-ranking officers. With his approval, they would step in to remove Michael from the throne and place Peter there in turn. The Prime Marshal was incensed by the suggestion. The schemers were turned away and threatened with dire actions should they continue in their efforts. He went on record soon after, publicly affirming his support of his nephew, but ultimately, the AWFS had made their point. Whether Peter and Michael ever communicated about the near revolt isn't clear, but the First Prince abandoned his peace proposal soon after, and charged his uncle with seeking a military victory for House Davian. After taking power within the Lyran Commonwealth, Claudius Steiner's psychopathic tendencies came to the forefront. A reign of terror is probably the most accurate way to describe his time in office. The LIC, especially the Loki agents, would spend their days rounding up anyone who had displeased the Archon. Those poor unfortunate individuals had an equal chance of being thrown in a cell to rot, forced to participate in horrific blood sports, or invited to a lavish dinner where Claudius would raise a toast to their good health. Miles Kempek, meanwhile, had the Lyran Commonwealth Armed Forces on lockdown. Helping to bolster the front line were the 12th Starguard, who had formed the Ratfrags 1 year earlier, then Lescouflaire's Landsknechts in 2846, meaning they now surpassed the Northwind Highlanders to become the largest mercenary brigade in existence. The LCAF expanded their contract to include all 5 regiments. Claudius Steiner was proving to be a terrible liability for the nation's defence. Because of this, the LIC was maintaining a watchful eye on their Spinwood neighbour, certain that Kurita would soon take advantage of the situation. The Bondians trained a number of courtesans to infiltrate the private households of the powerful and wealthy, hoping to glean any information that could give them forewarning of an invasion. The most successful of these was the Norn agent known as Snowfire, who in time would catch the eye of the coordinator himself. But Snowfire, or Denise Vanderham if that was her real name, was a double agent. She was in contact with the head of SAFE's Luthian station. The information she relayed back to the LIC may have allowed them to counter Kuritan raids, but it exaggerated the risk on that front. This allowed Marek an easier time of things when they launched lightning strikes at a Crux and Miser to disrupt the LCAF's activities, and another deep raid to Furillo, which caused much destruction. It was not, however, enough to prevent their attempt to retake Dixie from failing. Liao might have hoped that the end of the noble House Allison would bring a halt to advances on that front, but Hallis proved just as capable of continuing the offensive. The Sikaf doggedly held on to Wazan, but Harzafelt and Singhai would fall in 2846. Deep raids into the Confederation, striking at Second Try and even Harlock beyond Cyan, gave the Strategios little choice but to order their forces to shelter in place, knowing another attack could come at any location. The FWLM took advantage of this by launching another assault on Assumption in November. It was a short campaign, only lasting a month, but a very costly one. 40% of the troops dispatched to take the world would not return. The next year, House Humphreys was seeking retribution for the attacks on their ancestral home a decade prior. They launched their own raid against the Andurian Commonality's capital, and also recaptured Mozero. In 2847, Charles Marek would make his first return to Atreus since he departed for Irian half a decade earlier. He had left in disgrace, but returned to find a newfound support at home. The Captain General was well on his way to recovering the territory lost during the Comstar War, a remarkable turnaround. He would cement his popularity in Parliament the following year by lifting the ban on so-called restricted items, usually just luxuries the ruling class craved. With the new freedom granted him by the First Prince, Prime Marshal Peter Davian expanded AFFS operations to include the Draconis Combine Front. With an increased budget, he was able to hire the mercenary battalion Quinn's Quads to help with future actions in the march. Focusing on recovering worlds lost to the Dragon, Rowe was the first to be welcomed back into the fold, then Crossing and Glenmora in 2848. Simultaneously, he continued to drive his forces into the St. Ives Commonality, expanding the Capellan March with another pair of systems. For the past 7 years, Colonel Tiber Hinders had been resisting the occupation of New Caledonia. His troops had scattered into the hills to fight as guerrillas, making life hell for the garrison. The Sword of Light had long since departed, but the Coordinator's son, Hugai Kurita, still remained on world. Tiber and his brother Michael Hinders had called on the population to fight, and they did so in great numbers. Roughly 40,000 New Caledonians would be casualties of the vicious campaign, but by 2848, both sides knew that the resistance was doomed, and in July, the last of the Royal Guard were taken prisoner. There was no civility between the two commanders when Hugai met Tiber, but the Kuritan did at least offer satisfaction in a matter that had long weighed on Colonel Hinders' mind. Earlier in the campaign, the Royal Guards had been betrayed from within. Hugai offered a chance to face this turncoat in battle, which Tiber accepted. The two were loaded into a pair of mechs and faced off outside the capital city. Both proved exceptionally skilled, as to be expected from members of the elite Royal Guards, but ultimately Tiber won out. Approaching the ruined Thunderbolt, he he found his brother Michael's body within. Hugai executed the broken colonel moments later, along with the rest of his staff. It remains open to debate whether Michael was the spy, or if there even was one. Certainly it could be argued that the resistance should have fallen apart much sooner had there actually been treachery. A run of bad luck could easily have accounted for their misfortune back in 2843. Hugai proved how villainously manipulative he could be with his next act, so it's quite possible Michael Hinders was made the same deal as his brother, a chance to get even. Their battle to the death was for more than just Hugai's amusement. A recording of the duel was dispatched to Archon Claudius Steiner, a great lover of senseless violence himself. This cruel joke would be Kurita's undoing, as the mad successor lord swore bloody vengeance. He ordered the LIC to carry out Operation Praying Mantis, the assassination of the Kuritan family. The situation on the Marek-Liao border had stagnated into a series of costly raids. A strike at Altora in 2848 was bound to result in retaliation, which came at Ascension the next year. On planet were two of Charles's descendants, his son Garth and grandson Michael. It had become common for the family to take an active role on the front lines, but their safety was very much at risk at these exposed positions, as had been demonstrated when Michael's own father William was killed 6 years earlier. Using her latest mercenary acquisitions, Narhol's Raiders and Nai Tuka, to cover her flank, Chancellor Lorelei Liao ordered the Northwind Highlanders to seize the planet at any cost, and if the Marek family were to suffer a personal loss at the same time, so much the better. After failing to take out the two Marek heirs conventionally, the Seacaf pulled back and launched a nuclear weapon at their position, killing both instantly. Ascension was reclaimed once and for all soon after. Whatever Lorelei hoped to gain from this act, the consequences should have been obvious. A Freewells League vessel jumped into the heart of the Confederation, took up position over Capella itself, and fired its nuclear payload at the planet below. This was the last time in history that either successor state would deploy nuclear weapons, though both still jealously guard enormous stockpiles. In February 2849, Coordinator Yuguchi Kurita arrived on Tishomingo to personally lead the defense of this important planet. Despite belonging to the Federated Suns throughout the era of the Star League, the population had turned strongly in favor of the Draconis Combine during their many years of rulership in the First Succession War. Escorting him to the planet were his Sword of Light and 3 conventional regiments, adding their strength to the 6 militia regiments already on World. When Peter Davian arrived in March, he did so with an overwhelming force. 4 battle mech and 16 conventional units gave them a 2-to-1 advantage, 4-to-1 in mech disparity. Though they put up a fanatical resistance for a time, the Sword of Light was completely eradicated in April. The subjugation of Tishomingo was complete 2 months later. But here the Davian intelligence agencies failed them, as the presence of the Coordinator on World remained unknown. Yoguchi faded into the countryside, hoping to raise an army that could overthrow the garrison once the Prime Marshal's main strength moved on. He didn't have to wait long, as Peter's task force jumped to their next targets within the month, achieving similarly crushing victories there. On May 8, 2849, the people of the Lyran Commonwealth collectively breathed a deep sigh of relief when Archon Claudius Steiner suffered a coronary episode and died before medical aid could arrive. Some say that it was deliberately late in coming. Claudius had frequented hospitals during his time in office, and the Lyran doctors resented being forced to keep many poor individuals alive to suffer through ever more extreme torture methods during the Mad Steiner's reign of terror. Other rumours suggest that his mother forced him to drink poison, or he was smothered by his wife. Whatever the reason, he was dead, and his 8-year-old daughter Elizabeth was far too young to take his place. Rebecca Morgan, Claudius's partner, stepped in to bring some semblance of order back to the Commonwealth, beginning by reconvening the Estates General. They agreed that a regent would be needed to safeguard the realm until Elizabeth came of age, but there was no consensus on who that should be. To avoid a repeat of Melissa Nin's disastrously short reign, a compromise was found, and on October 13th, a trio of candidates were elected to form a triumvirate. This council consisted of Speaker of the Assembly Henri de Calidore and the Duchesses Eliza Atton and Rebecca Morgan herself. Over at Luthien, the Coordinator's apparent death had sent shockwaves through the Imperial City. Upon his return to the Combine, the DCMS commander had reported that Yuguchi had been killed in action on Tishomingo. There was also the small matter of the Sword of Light being down a regiment, but the 8th could be fairly easily reformed. After the death of his firstborn in a battle mech accident some years earlier, Yuguchi had not named an heir. Hugai would have been next in line, but he was not present at court at this vital moment. Even if he had been, it's unlikely that he would have had the support to supplant his aunt Rowena, who stepped forward as the acting coordinator until the nobility could settle the matter. Rumours were circulating that a Kuritan operative was fomenting a rebellion back on Tishomingo. Davian was trying to stamp out the unrest, but feared that they would soon be facing a large uprising. Their priorities shifted drastically when word got out that the supposed ISF agent inciting the population to violence was none other than Yuguchi Kurita himself. Davian immediately gave orders to move more troops to the planet, but he was beaten to the punch by the coordinator's sister Rowena. She had her suspicions that her brother was still alive, and so had already dispatched a relief force before the truth had come out. A quartet of DCMS regiments made landfall in August, to find that much of the population had taken up arms in support of Kurita. Before the AFFS reinforcements could arrive, Yuguchi was heading out of the system for good. Tishomingo would become one of the bloodiest battles of the Second Succession War, surpassed only by those rare instances where WMDs struck population centres. Restoring order to the chaos that had broken out upon the Coordinator's successful escape would ultimately cost the lives of 3 million civilians, many of whom had willingly given their lives in service to the Draconis Combine. Yuguchi Kurita's return to Luthien after the near disaster at Tishomingo was a triumph celebrated across the Draconis Combine. Their quick action allowed them to snatch the Coordinator out from under Davian's sword moments before they could land a killing blow. Despite the fact they had lost the battle, his resistance in the face of overwhelming odds was an enormous morale boost for the mustered soldiery. Those few months of uncertainty had caused considerable turmoil at court, however, and so to ensure that such a situation did not arise again, Yuguchi took this moment to name his successor. The Coordinator thought little of his 2 surviving sons. Hugai was a touch too psychotic even for his family, while Toragi was a political schemer whose physical disabilities had kept him out of the military. In another realm, he would have been a fine pick, but in the excessively martial society of the Draconis Combine, he would simply not do. His sister Rowena had proven herself more than capable during his absence. Her ties to the ISF and time with the PRE made her supremely qualified, were it not for one simple matter: she was a woman. Not since Sariwan McAllister Kurita had manipulated and murdered her way to the top back in the 26th century and again in the 27th, had there been a female coordinator. That Suriwan was probably one of the best in their history was easily forgotten in their patriarchal society. Therefore, Rowena too was passed over. In the end, Yuguchi settled on his younger brother Miyogi. He had the military career, the political experience, and the right gender to appease all parties. Anything Miyogi lacked, he would surely have sufficient time to learn while his older sibling held the reins of government. Of course, the best laid plans of mice and men often go awry, and dragons are no exception to that rule. Despite his desires, Yuguchi would never again leave Luthien. Within the year, he was slain. What transpired was a near-perfect storm. First to feel the mailed fist of Steiner vengeance was Hugai Kurita. Operation Praying Mantis, begun by the mad Archon Claudius 2 years prior, called for the death of the Coordinator and his barbarous son. Despite a change in rulership within the Commonwealth, the Lyran Intelligence Corps went ahead with the assassination. The hitmen perhaps played their hand too soon by targeting Hugai first. The attempt on his life was not wholly successful, though Kurita's life-threatening injuries kept him in a coma for several crucial months. When word of the operation made its way to the ears of the ISF director Malcolm Katsuyori, he zealously hunted for any Lyran agents hidden at court, spoiling any chance of their success. Claudius's efforts to bring the Coordinator to justice had come up short. Unbeknownst to anyone, there was a grave threat lurking in Yuguchi's own bedchamber. Of all the courtesans within the Imperial City, his favourite was the Lyran agent Snowfire. She had avoided the ISF's purge as she knew nothing of the planned assassination, belonging to an entirely separate branch of the LIC. At some point, word of the plot passed from Katsuyori's lips to Rowena's. She too was rumoured to be one of Snowfire's lovers. If Rowena was suspicious of Vanderham's private letters back to her mother in the Commonwealth, she did not mention it to her brother or lover, nor did the ISF ever decipher a code from the messages. Praying Mantis might have been stopped were it not for the fact that Snowfire was made aware of the operation by her safe contact. In her past life, she had been in love with a member of the 4th Royal Guards. Learning of their grisly fate was enough to make her act. For their part, the Freewills League rightfully suspected that the murder of the Coordinator would bring about harsh retribution, in turn giving them the opportunity to make further gains on the Lyran front. MIIO records suggest they too had their own operative embedded within Unity Palace. Performing the assassination would be no simple matter, but it appears Snowfire was aided in some way by this unknown agent. Perhaps they were the source of the knife she would use, or supplied her with keys that allowed her to move through the palace unseen. Alternatively, they could have been one of the guards responsible for ensuring the safety of Kurita's bedroom, who allowed her entry with the weapon. We will likely never be able to distinguish complicity from complacency. On December 12, 2850, Snowfire cut Yuguchi's throat while he slept. She placed on his body the insignia of the Royal Guards, then drank a vial of fast-acting poison and lay down beside him. They were found dead in the morning. As per Yuguchi's wishes, his brother Miyogi was named Coordinator after his death. His first act was to purge the entire palace staff of any individuals with even a trace of Lyran heritage. 54 people were rounded up and executed. With his bloodlust sated for the moment, Miyogi began plotting a far grander operation. Like his predecessor, he would return to the infamous world of Hesperus. "2850 was little more than a year of raiding for the Inner Sphere. The same exhaustion that had crept in towards the end of the First Succession War was starting to rear its head again. One of the only factions to make any notable moves was the Freewills League. They had hired the Myrmidons the previous year, sending them to strike at the Federation of Sky at Alioth and Kalidasa. This prompted the Lyrans to hire Murphy's Law, while the 12th Star Guard expanded to 6 regiments with the addition of Rippon's Grenadiers. On the Liao border, FWLM units were pummeling the Capella Commonalty at Chitwan and Ingersoll, while other troops moved to secure nearby Old Kentucky and Kalmar further rimward. For their part, the Capellans launched a raid against the Federated Sons to strike at the factories of Axton, but suffered another loss when Davion took Pentvar. 2851 would see only a single raid against Ford before the Captain General's focus shifted elsewhere to deal with a humanitarian disaster on Hassad caused by an enormous tidal wave. Mercenaries would continue to be in demand as the Usyk Irregulars formed within the Combine, part of Miyogi's preparations for his grand offensive. Charles returned to his raiding campaign in 2852 with attacks on Hall and Wazet, but again he was the only successor lord making moves. A far larger effort would soon commence along the Lyran border, but it would begin with one of the few periphery actions of the Succession Wars. The Black Warriors had been a constant thorn in Marik's side since they were left behind by Kerensky's SLDF. To bring an end to this irritants, in 2853 the Captain General tasked the Eridani Light Horse with subduing their old brothers in arms. Colonel Ezra Bradley, former hero of the Star League Civil War, was over 100 years old by this point, but he still participated in planning the assault. On their way to their destination, the mercenaries would attempt to retake a pair of Steiner worlds, drawing the Triumvirate's attention away from their main objective. The operation got off to an inauspicious start. Though Magrez was captured, Charles's grandson Thomas was killed in the effort. Ilian proved more stubborn and not worth the effort given their true intentions lay elsewhere. In the end, only one regiment was needed to overwhelm the pirates. The Cercinus Federation was subdued without any significant fighting. The Freewells League claimed they were there to prevent the farmers from being exploited by the renegade mercs, but in truth, later garrisons took advantage of the locals far more than the Black Warriors ever did. A truce was agreed with their colonel, Angelica Chirion, that would allow the former mercenaries to join forces with the Eridani Light Horse and launch diversionary raids on Lyran worlds at the extreme end of the border. A much larger offensive under the command of the Captain General's heir Gerald Marik was about to commence, and trouble in the Protectorate of Donegal would prevent Steiner from being able to direct all of their reinforcements to the Federation of Sky alone. First to feel the wrath of the Black Warriors was Pancada on April 4th. On their way out of the system 3 days later, Colonel Chirion informed her Eridani counterpart that she had just received new orders. The two were to hit Bilawela, which they did on the 17th. Once on the ground, the Cercinus pirates returned to their old ways, robbing several banks while the Light Horse took on the militia. The whole operation had been a fabrication, earning the ire of Colonel Idris Majed in the process. Gerald Marik's offensive got underway soon after, and met with mixed success. Though they were able to capture 5 planets with the help of 2 new mercenary regiments, Willoughby's Wildcats and Xiao's Caissons, Devil's Rock was somewhat of a Pyrrhic victory, as the invasion force suffered around 60% casualties. Furthermore, 3 of the targeted worlds had managed to drive them back. Rising tensions between the Black Warriors and Eridani Light Horse finally erupted into violence on July 5th, while the two were conducting a raid on Starshine. Again, the pirates had picked their own target based solely on the value of what they could pillage. Initially, the mercenaries and garrison engaged each other, but a deal was reached with the Lyran commander that would allow them to work together to put a stop to the pirate menace. Majed personally downed Angelica's battlemaster, then stranded the rest of her unit on Starshine for the Commonwealth to deal with. The Light Horse arrived back on Cercinus on the 28th. Ezra Bradley would formally hand over control of the regimental combat team to Idris Majed upon their return. What few Black Warriors remained on planet were disarmed, though they would re-emerge as a threat in later years. In the end, the whole operation proved pointless. It was intended as a way to bypass the heavily defended Pohlsbo and strike at juicier targets along the Commonwealth's periphery border, but no such attacks ever took place. Elizabeth Steiner in 2853 was only 13 years old, but she had already learned much about how her realm functioned by attending meetings of the Triumvirate. Each one of her regents was pulling in a different direction. Henri de Calidore wanted to increase the power of the Estates General, but he was also somewhat of a military poser despite his lack of knowledge on such matters. Duchess Eliza Atten had family ties to both Skye and Tamar, and was a strong advocate of regional power. Her mother, Duchess Rebecca Morgan, was firmly pro-Steiner and wished to see their control of the Commonwealth expanded. While all three frequently disagreed, they could at least function as a unified bloc when their realm was threatened from outside. Their greatest challenge came on April 9, 2853. Just as the Madoc invasion was commencing, a Draconis Combine Admiralty armada arrived at Hesperus. The attack had been in the planning stages for many years. Miyogi may have taken the credit, but it was mostly his dead brother's work. Spearheading the assault were all 6 of Kurita's remaining warships, the last of their kind in service anywhere within the Inner Sphere. It was a weapon that Steiner had no answer for. The warship juggernauts of the other successor state navies had all met fairly ignominious ends during the Second Succession War. The Federated Sons Navy Department of the Line lost their last Congress D to a Capellan mine, while their final Nucertus class FSS Pleiades broke in two while journeying back from the front for repairs. The Great Soil class, pride of the Liao and Madoc fleets, was picked apart by fighters its colossal mass driver was incapable of targeting. The rest of their fleets were either decommissioned or scrapped. The 6th Battle of Hesperus began when Taisho Susumu Fujiwara commanded the naval group to capture the recharge stations, swiftly crushing the defences around the facilities. Over 100 aerospace fighters and 40 larger vessels were destroyed at the expense of 20 fighters and less than a dozen dropships. With the space lanes secure, he moved his force into orbit and began a long siege that would go on for another 20 weeks. This lengthy pause is why history books often break down what is essentially just one year-long campaign into 3 separate battles. The ground invasion, historically dubbed the 7th Battle of Hesperus, began in late August. Defending the planet were a trio of battlemech regiments and 6 conventional ones. Continual airstrikes over the last 5 months had significantly depleted their supplies and shattered their morale. Arrayed against them were a terrifying 8 mech and 15 conventional units, all under the command of Taisho Carson Santander. The war on Hesperus was a brutal affair that claimed the lives of many of the defenders. Throughout September, the LCAF was ground down, while the abundance of DCMS regiments on hand allowed them to rotate the units regularly to keep them all well rested. Efforts to break through the blockade and relieve the garrison were continually turned back by the massive naval task force in orbit. By the end of October, the Arcturan Guards and 4 conventional regiments had been destroyed. The rest of the garrison had been isolated away from the factory complex. Taisho Santander closed in for the kill on October 25th, but as they approached the fortified gate, the factory workers within sallied forth to meet them. Baron Ivar Brewer had organised them into a so-called Force of Last Resort, and this was that moment. The unit was outfitted with factory-fresh or in some cases incomplete battle mechs, and though they had next to zero combat experience, the surprise ambush forced Carson to pull back so he could regroup. Crashing into their flank came the last mechs of the Sky Rangers, inflicting heavy casualties on the disorganized Kuritans. Despite the setback, the DCMS rallied and cleared the field of the last Steiner holdouts. After 5 failed attempts, it looked as if the production lines on Hesperus were finally going to fall. Kurita would make use of the facility themselves until a sufficiently strong counterattack dislodged them, but no doubt they would sabotage the complex on their way out to ensure it could no longer be used to support the Lyran war effort. This would have been the likely outcome had not Henri de Calidore suggested a bold plan back in September. The decommissioned LCS Invincible had been moved to Tharkad some years earlier, now serving as nothing more than a museum piece, but could feasibly be brought back into service. The biggest problem would be crewing the battlecruiser, as the only naval officers with experience fighting in such a vessel had long since retired. For the second time in the war, the Commonwealth turned to their oldest veterans for their salvation. While they trained together for the upcoming battle, the Lyran garrison was paying a heavy price in blood to protect the Defiance Industries factory. As Santander was closing on the facility below, the Invincible had materialized overhead, beginning the 8th Battle of Hesperus. The DCA warships had a distinct numbers advantage, but their largest vessel was a Baron-class destroyer, barely half the size of their opponent. Furthermore, not one shipyard remained in operation that could still service such massive naval juggernauts, and so their warships were all in a miserable state of repair. Invincible blasted its way through DCS Yedo, while its fighters picked apart the aging Vigilant-class DCS Worm, but the battlecruiser took no notice of the remaining vessels as the crew centered their weapons on the battle raging below. Victory for House Kurita was within their grasp, but at that moment, the Combine mechs were transported back in time to the original invasion of 2787 and got to experience firsthand the horrors their predecessors had during the First Succession War, as massed orbital fire rained down on top of them. The survivors, of which there were few, scattered into the mountains, while the crew of LCS Invincible turned back to more pressing matters. The bypassed warships had maneuvered behind her and trapped the Tharkad class in low orbit. Any other ship might have accepted the inevitable, but not that crew. In a masterclass of naval warfare, the Invincible battled their way free. As each ship tried in vain to land the killing shot, they came into range of our massive weapons arsenal, and each in turn was explosively disassembled. By mid-November, it was clear to Miyogi that a victory was no longer possible, and he angrily called for a retreat. 10 regiments had been lost in the assault, almost half their force. The Lyrans had suffered far worse. 90% of their materiel was destroyed, with 70% casualties across the board. For their sacrifice, the Force of Last Resort, of which only 5 individuals had survived, was awarded the Dragon Slayer's ribbon. Brewer was given the Medal of Honor and made Duke of Hesperus for his crucial role in assembling the ad hoc battalion. The story of the LCS Invincible, the Ionosphere's last warship, is legendary, but the ending is not what anyone would have wished for. On the return voyage to Tharkad, the ancient vessel's jump drive malfunctioned, and the ship with her crew vanished from existence. No trace of them has ever been found. It's often said that with her disappearance, warships as a whole passed into legend. This is essentially true, but not wholly accurate. Ignoring the discovery and subsequent destruction of SLS Tirpitz in the late 30th century, and the never-ending rumours of a hidden Comstar fleet, 2 nations are still known to possess warships in 3025. The first is the Taurian Concordat, where the decaying hulk of TCS Vandenberg can be found deep inside the Hades cluster. The Taurians have often mentioned their desire to bring this ancient Vincent-class corvette back into service and reclaim their former status as a naval power, but the cost of doing so would likely bankrupt the realm. The second is the Draconis Combine. 2 or 3 of the advanced Narukami-class destroyers had already been decommissioned before the Second Succession War was even underway. The damage was extensive and the enormous repair bill unjustifiable. 2 centuries of decay have only compounded those issues. These days, the derelicts drift aimlessly through space and are almost certainly beyond the abilities of the Kuritans to restore. More famously, DCS Togura still orbits above the ancestral home of House Kurita. Even before the battle at Hesperus, this Samarkand-class carrier was written off as being unspaceworthy, and has long since been abandoned. The warship lingers on as a curiosity, a reminder of a bygone era perhaps best left in the past. It remains unclear as to whether such awesomely destructive vessels will ever be constructed again. In 2853, House Humphreys reclaimed the planet Cursa. This had been the location from which Safe had carried out Operation Cookie Jar, fabricating the existence of an SLDF cache and triggering the Comstar War. The Terran communications cult had been eerily quiet in the years since Raymond Karpov called an end to Operation Holy Shroud back in 2845. The successor states had lost faith in their neutrality, and so perhaps they were trying to avoid doing anything that might draw further attention to themselves. In an ironic twist, just one jump away from Cursa, a real weapons stockpile was discovered within the Foghorn Highlands on Lopez. The Primus had made it his mission to secure or destroy any facilities containing Starleague-era technology, and so dispatched a ROM team to Lopez while leaking word of the find to Liao on August 12th. When the CCAF arrived 3 weeks later, the ROM agents used the ensuing battle as cover to detonate the entire complex, keeping the priceless artifacts out of the hands of both successor states. The success on Lopez perhaps encouraged Karpov to renew his efforts to subvert the Great Houses. He believed that the indoctrination of Jeanette Maddock and intention to use her as a puppet ruler was a good plan fumbled by his predecessor Toyama. The next year, he would task his organization with finding other heirs who he might be able to bring into the fold. Fighting on the Capellan front carried on into 2854. La Reconquista pushed into the Cyan Commonalty, taking Ipswich, Lukla, and Sappho, but the FWLM overreached by trying to grab Gudna too. The Northwind Highlanders beat them back, but lost a battalion in the effort. This was a rare victory for House Liao at this stage in the war, as Capellan logistics were on the verge of collapse. They could barely supply their forces at their current garrisons, let alone move troops around for an offensive. No matter their recent successes, few within the Freewells League could celebrate in 2854. It would in fact be a year of mourning. On March 9th, Captain General Charles Maddock passed away after almost 33 years in office. His reign is a divisive one amongst historians. In a single year, he reversed every gain the League had made during the First Succession War that billions had died fighting for. He brought the wrath of Comstar onto his nation and allowed Parliament to run amok, nearly causing the destruction of his realm. These actions taken out of context look atrocious, but they only tell half the story. Charles's legacy is one of recovery in the face of insurmountable odds. In his first decade, he wisely focused post-war rebuilding efforts on the military, had no desire to get dragged into yet another succession war, worked to mitigate one of the League's biggest shortcomings in their intelligence agency, and for his efforts was duped into launching a preemptive strike to secure his territory. He then faced off with Konrad Toyama, the secret power behind the entire conflict. Maddock called his bluff, and though he ultimately capitulated, Toyama was himself ruined by Charles's defiance. His MPs never believed his justification for the attack on the HBG at Oriente, and as such turned against him. Even still, his actions up to that point had won him allies among the nobility, rebuilding a relationship which his father Thaddeus had all but destroyed. His sons and daughter, and their children too, followed his example to enlist, fighting at the front lines alongside their soldiers in a way that few ruling families do, and many had given their lives in the effort. Charles's legacy is a complicated one, not without missteps, but in my estimation, he deserves a place alongside his grandfather Kenyon and their ancestors Albert and Marion as four of the finest leaders the Freewells League has seen. When word of his passing reached the front line, his eldest and only surviving son Gerald returned back to Atreus to be sworn in as the new Captain General. He was there for only 9 weeks before departing back to the front in order to lead the next wave of attacks against Steiner, leaving the governance of the realm in the trustworthy hands of Joost van Kamp. Alhina, Oliver and Wing were all taken that year, but Callison rebuffed their efforts. Nearby, the 12th Star Guard achieved their greatest extent with the addition of a 7th Regiment, Dunderdale's Ironmen, making them by far the largest mercenary unit in existence at that moment, almost double their nearest rivals, the Elysian Rangers and Northwind Highlanders. The ruling family was not wholly united behind the new Captain General. His son Maxwell refused to be named heir, and instead declared his intention to follow in his great-aunt's footsteps by joining Comstar, later rising to the rank of Precentor. This was the first real coup of Karpov's latest scheme, and showed that not everyone within the Great House had accepted Charles's justification for the attack on his sister's HBG station. Maxwell would not be the last Marek to be initiated into the Comstar Order. Miyogi Kurita's campaign to take control of Hesperus may have ended unsuccessfully, but this was far from the only operation he had planned. 2854 saw the beginning of what would become known as the Marathon Offensive. The DCMS would move against both of their rivals more or less simultaneously, but we'll review the Lyran front first. The Warlord of Benjamin had been busy conducting their own minor campaign, expanding by another 2 systems in the years since the new coordinator came to power. In time, Camlanshire would become the focal point of the operation, but initially the campaign stretched along the entire length of the border, with no particular goal other than to seize whatever they could. Incursions into the Federation of Sky were driven back, with a raid on Constance being the only tangible success, but moves against the Tamar Pact showed more promise. Port Moresby and Satellitcha held on, but a raid on Degolan revealed a weakness there that a second attack soon exploited. On the periphery end of the border, Planting and Ridderkirk changed hands. The Federated Sons half of the Marathon Offensive commenced with a raid in force on the infamous world of Kintari IV. The garrison there was near fanatical in their defense, as might be expected, but this worked to Kurita's favor. He exploited their desire to hunt down the evasive DCMS forces sent there, drawing ever more of the region's AFFS into what was only ever meant to be a diversion. The campaign would begin in earnest on June 10th, with an attack on Franklin and Lucerne, the latter of which would be the first outing for Big Kev's brigade, hired by the DCMS the previous year. Their weight in numbers helped offset their inexperience, and by the 3rd month, Lucerne as well as Franklin were both secured. Other Kuritan units unleashed hell on Ballantine, eradicating the Davian presence and virtually everything else on planet. Elsewhere, the invasions of Karnak and LeBlanc, which began the final string of attacks in mid-July, were driven back, the latter defeat coming on New Year's Day. Rochester proved another tough nut to crack. The battle raged for 11 months until the arrival of Big Kev's brigade turned the tables in their favour. The primary objective of the entire offensive, though, was the capture of Robinson. The Draconis March capital was hugely important to the defence of the region, and yet, since the fall of the Star League, had spent almost as much time under Kuritan occupation as under House Sandoval's own control. Coordinator Miyogi Kurita himself would lead the attack at the head of almost the entire Sword of Light Brigade, supported by an additional 10 regiments of conventional forces. They were evenly matched by Field Marshal Jerome Davien's force, who possessed only one fewer battle mech unit. Despite the relative parity in numbers, the skill of the Sword of Light started to shine through, and Davien soon found himself on the back foot. He repeatedly called for reinforcements, but so much was being dispatched to Kintari, what little did trickle in wasn't enough to offset his losses. Jerome's battle was only just beginning in 2854, and the planet would suffer immensely before it was over. In December, the DCMS next struck at Sonmin, then DeWitt in February, and Kestrel in July. The goal was to push right through to New Avalon, but believing such a thing was possible at this stage in the war was beyond optimistic. Every Kuritan was chased off in due course. The only gains they did make in 2855 came closer to the border, Al-Nadal and Kosa. The Lyran half of the offensive, now aided by the Red Baron's mercenary battalion, focused on the Tamar Pact in 2855, taking 4 more systems for Kurita, then a 5th when they converted their raid on Kellenfold to an occupation, creating an outrageously deep salient into the Kelswar realm. Only Moritz put up a resistance, though there was some small consolation for Steiner when a counterattack on Orbison by the newly hired Final Reckoning saw one of their first succession war losses reversed. Gerald Maddox's main objective for the year was to rebuild the Syrian Concordance. All 3 of their lost systems were wrestled out of the hands of either the Capellans or Lyrans. The former tried to curtail any further losses by augmenting their forces with another merc unit, Damage Inc. The Andurian conflict continued as well, with Humphreys winning another 5 planets for their growing duchy, though 3 of those would be deemed inhospitable and abandoned by war's end. They followed this up in 2856 with 2 more conquests, though Rosendahl resisted their advances for the time being. The LCAF's defense was firming up across the realm in 2856, as they yet again beat back attempts by Kurita to take Mor and Satellitsha. With their morale boosted by these victories, Steiner caught the Draconis Combine off guard when they advanced into their territory, taking back the vulnerable Kellenfold a year after its capture, and also seizing Buckminster and Vega, the latter thanks to help from their newest mercs, Beck's battalion. Trolloc Prime proved too much for them at the moment, but they were not disheartened. The Marathon Offensive had become a bit of a damp squib. The armed forces of the Federated Suns countered every move the DCMS made in 2856. An attack on Solturul in January began the year, but went nowhere. Donoval and Roman held on, and in January the AFS finally secured a victory on Kintari, though it was one that had cost them dearly. Even though Peter Davien's forces were holding their ground, the campaign was grinding them down. No one was in any sort of position to relieve the forces on Robinson. By 2857, the writing was on the wall for the Draconis March capital, and the AFS began withdrawing their mercenaries from the planet. They immediately began looking for opportunities to employ them elsewhere, with the Xi'an hotheads launching a successful strike against Bene 3 in April. Kurita wasn't willing to give up the world yet, but a counter-invasion was turned back by the victorious troops. Davien would also hire Cupric Byzantium that year to aid in their defense. To ensure that they would not have to fight on 2 fronts at once, Capellan March forces maintained the pressure on the St. Ives commonality. While they were repulsed from Spica, they managed to wrestle control of Hadnol away from Liao. For the second year in a row, the LCAF came out ahead of the DCMS. Port Moresby resisted a second attempt by Kurita to seize control of the system, though nearby Naja could not. 4 planets within the Dieron military district were targeted by Steiner, and all but Al-Nazl were taken. A dozen or so light-years away, the Free Wills League moved to reclaim Alula Australis, but otherwise the border here was quiet. The Duchy of Andurian proved to be the only real hotspot along the Capellan border in the latter years of the Second Succession War. In 2857, House Humphreys secured Ithaca and Mataskogan, then Viribium and Claybrook the next year, though the latter was an arduous effort that cost both sides dearly. Kurita's efforts in 2858 centred around Camlanshire, but they could only manage to take Orestes, failing to gain a foothold on Caldria or Glenlivet. With the Kelsois forces struggling to hold on, a minor redistricting of the border provinces brought Lestrade forces further forward to assist. A large chunk of the Tamar Pact had been cut off, which the neighbouring Federation of Skye soon subsumed into Cannonshire, thereby creating Orkneyshire as the new Rimwood province of the Tamar Pact. For the most part, the LCAF continued to show the DCMS up on the field. Steiner focused on the former hegemony worlds where the population was less indoctrinated into the Combine way of life. Lambrecht held, but Lyon would become part of the Isle of Skye. One event in 2858 that highlighted the advantages and pitfalls of the Inner Sphere military's increasing dependence on mercenaries to do their job was the success of the Draconis Combine in convincing the massive 12th Starguard Brigade not to renew their contract with Steiner and instead take up employment with the Dragon. At the drop of a hat, they had gained half a dozen regiments, while their rivals lost that number. It goes to show that it doesn't matter how loyal a unit is, if a better offer comes along, it can be difficult to turn it down. Of course, the Coordinator had a far more insidious way of ensuring their long-term loyalty, the infamous company store policy. The AFFS was doing its utmost to hold back the Dragon, repelling an assault on Crossing and taking Cassius from Gallatin. However, this did little to distract the Federated Sons from their more significant defeat. In August 2858, the 4-year battle for Robinson came to an end. It was a campaign that would leave permanent scars on the Draconis March and relations between the two states. Miyogi Kurita's profligate use of WMDs had turned the planet's surface into an irradiated hellscape. A shocking total of 17 nuclear bombs had been used to scour the enemy defences, as well as vast quantities of chemical weapons and biological agents. The Coordinator would redeploy another 6 infantry regiments to the planet after his victory, probably dooming a great number of those soldiers to a lifetime of health complications brought on by the lingering after-effects of so many hazardous materials released into the atmosphere. With his new prize secure, Miyogi Kurita called a halt to the Marathon Offensive on December 9th. Robinson was very much a campaign straight out of the First Succession War, and that's reflected in the death toll. Somewhere between 450,000 to 2.2 million civilians were killed during the fight for Robinson, with another 4 million wounded. The chemical and biological attacks towards the end of the battle meant that this number would climb dramatically over the next 6 months. By January 19, 2859, approximately 8 million had succumbed to horrific illnesses, 12 million wounded would never fully recover, and another 79 million people were displaced, as several towns and cities had to be abandoned to the toxic clouds. We don't have enough surviving records from the Second Succession War to say for certain, but these horrendous figures most likely represent the greatest loss of life sustained by any one planet during the entire conflict. It was a human tragedy that would cement the belief among the people of the Draconis March that the entire Kuritan family was evil beyond redemption. In the latter half of the Second Succession War, the Free Wills League was undergoing a slight shift in its internal boundaries. During the Comstar War, the Matic Commonwealth had been outvoted in Parliament by rival power blocs, seriously hampering the Captain General's efforts to halt their enemy's advance and counteract the effects of Comstar's interdiction. This was something which his son Gerald Matic was eager to avoid a repeat of, should he ever find himself in the same boat. The Principality of Regulus had long been a thorn in his family's side, the shift from House Salage to Cameron Jones back in the 27th century having done little to change that state of affairs. The Duchy of Andurian had typically supported the Great House, but could potentially become another rival in the future, as they had grown more than any other province during the Succession Wars. Work to destabilize these provinces had resulted in Regulus losing 10 systems, while another 8 declared their independence from Andurian. The Matic Commonwealth, by contrast, picked up another pair of worlds closer to Terra, increasing its number of MPs in Parliament. 2859 saw the end of the almost 2-decade-long La Reconquista effort by the Grand Duchy of Oriente. Overall, it had been a tremendous success, but its final year was not so special. Anagasaki and Chengdu turned them back, and while A and Leao were taken, the Capellans enacted a scorched earth policy as they withdrew from the latter. Andurian forces also returned to Aquagia in 2859, over 20 years after they had abandoned it during the Comstar War. To their surprise, they found that FWLM Special Forces had been leading a popular uprising for pretty much that entire time. The population welcomed the League back as liberators. Loss of territory wasn't Liao's only concern, as Narhol's raiders returned back to Steiner employ after a decade of unhappy service with the Confederation. This loss was softened by the addition of Lothar's Fusiliers to the ranks of the Chesterton Reserves during the 2850s, the last mech regiments to be raised from scratch by the SECAF during the war. On January 20th, 2859, Elizabeth Steiner turned 19. Her birthday celebration saw the triumvirate peacefully pass control of the realm down to their young ward. To thank them for their faithful service, the new Archon immediately gave them tasks she knew would keep them well away from court, quite content to never see Henri de Calidore or Eliza Atten ever again. The former was given command of the 23rd Lyran Regulars, the only new mech regiment the LCAF would raise during the Long War. The latter was given the Herculean task of overseeing the relief effort for those displaced by foreign aggression. Rebecca Morgan had always supported her daughter, and you can see Elizabeth's gratitude in the contrasting job she gave her mother compared to the others, protecting endangered species with the Environmental Services Department. A few tit-for-tat actions continued along the Commonwealth Combine border in 2859, even after the end of the Marathon Offensive. The former took Atria, the latter Basiliano. The DCMS also contracted the Wildcards to supplement their abilities in the region. 2860 would see a pair of high-profile casualties for the two successor states. A raid on Sakhalin may have failed to achieve their intended objectives, but it did result in the death of the Lyran hero Henri de Calidore in only his first battle. Further forward, the War Griffins had just arrived on Krella after their contract with the Federated Suns had been terminated prematurely. In the final months of 2858, they had conducted a reconnaissance raid on Robinson to assess enemy strength and deployments. The intel was found to be sorely lacking when the AFFS returned to the planet in early 2860, and the War Griffins took the lion's share of the blame for the way the counterattack unfolded. Their situation went from bad to worse when the Kuritans arrived on Krella in March. The Mercs were swiftly overwhelmed, but did manage to exact some vengeance on behalf of Steiner when they killed the despised Hugai Kurita. The few surviving mercenaries fled to the periphery to join up with Hendrik Grimm. One of the most exposed systems along the border was the Tamar Domain's capital. Thinking that an invasion was likely imminent, the LCAF dispatched reinforcements to the planet and the staging grounds on nearby Severin. What they had not anticipated was for a trio of Kuritan mech regiments and 7 more conventional to hit Sakhalin again for the second time that year. There was little hope of repelling such a large force. The Kuritans further expanded their salient by taking Pilakua by year's end. 2 of the most contentious systems along the Marek-Steiner border were again the site of battles in 2860. The Freewelds dispatched the Eridani Light Horse to raid Judonné, but this may have weakened their position further along the border. The Lyrans evened the score later that year when Megrez once again switched sides. Fresh defeat at the former Draconis March capital forced Prime Marshal Peter Davian to call a halt to operations along the Kuritan border. While the AFFS reorganised for a much larger effort to reclaim the Robinson Bulge in a few years' time, First Prince Michael Davian tasked Peter with launching another offensive against House Liao. Operation Winter Garden aimed to create a large salient deep into the Capella commonality. The campaign got off to a strong start. The flag of the Federated Suns was soon flying over half a dozen new worlds. On September 19th, the Prime Marshal led an assault force of 2 battlemech and 8 conventional regiments to Camel. This should have been an overwhelming force, as they had yet to come up against any significant resistance. As the dropships descended through atmosphere, they came under withering anti-air fire. Among those hit by the AA that smashed into the planet's surface was Davian's command vessel, throwing the entire operation into complete disarray. As the Capellan Confederation has steadily lost ground to both of its neighbours during the Succession Wars, the realm had become increasingly narrow. Chancellor Lorelei Liao wisely saw an opportunity in this apparent vulnerability. She could hold much of her strength in reserve along the centre line of the Confederation and manoeuvre them to whichever front they were needed far quicker than Davian or Marek would have considered possible in their own territory. This is exactly what caught out Peter Davian, whose attack group had run face first into those reinforcements. The 3 attacks that were scheduled to begin after Camel were immediately called off, as the First Prince raced to restore some semblance of order to the campaign. In mid-October, the newly christened Operation Jade Castle struck again, this time against Alcyone and Daniels, 2 planets that the Federated Suns had taken all the way back in 2833 as part of Operation Leopard. With momentum on their side, the Capellans looked like they might be about to get the upper hand for the first time since the early days of Operation Celt. In their hour of deliverance, fate intervened in the most cruel way. Word of their success made it back to the Jade Palace on Cyan on October 18th. The next morning, Lorelei Liao suffered a stroke. She died 11 days later. Whatever destabilizing effect the loss of the Prime Marshal had had on the AFFS, because of the structure of the CCAF, which places the Chancellor at the head of all operations and makes use of no ranks above Colonel, Lorelei's death at this crucial moment was so much worse. With no children to inherit her position, the Prefectorate selected her brother Dainmar to be the next Chancellor, though his lack of military experience was a serious concern. To cap it all off, Peter Davian had survived the crash landing and managed to evade capture. His task force was almost at the point of surrender when he waltzed back into their camp and took charge of the situation. The odds were stacked against them, but they were given a reprieve when Dainmar withdrew his forces from Camel back to a secondary defensive line, a major blunder to begin his term of office. With Jade Castle abandoned and Winter Garden now back under the Prime Marshal's control, the Confederation was facing a catastrophe. Gerald Marek's campaigns had seen some limited success in recovering their lost worlds. But the mood in the Freewells League was starting to shift as those in power questioned whether continuing the conflict was still prudent. The Captain General swore that he would not rest until all of their territory was reclaimed. Gerald's insistence on pursuing a course of war at a time when the Inner Sphere was beginning to seek a way out of it may have been his undoing. On March 3, 2861, he died suddenly from a heart attack. So goes the official story. There have been several suggestions over the years that members of Parliament took action to remove the Captain General, though these rumours are unsubstantiated. Marek's death was exactly the kind of opportunity that Raymond Karpov had been hoping for when he convinced Gerald's son Maxwell to join the Comstar Order. If he returned to stake his claim, Karpov could maneuver a puppet ruler into control of one of the successor states. But curiously, this never took place. Various histories of the era contradict each other on Maxwell's time of death. Some state that he had predeceased his father, potentially after coming to blows with the First Circuit over his disinterest in the Captain General's position. As such, it was left to his aunt Philippa Marek to step forward in his place. Undeterred by the missed opportunity, Raymond would welcome another young Marek scion into the order the next year, Elizabeth Marek. Philippa's policy on the matter of peace was much more agreeable to the war-weary populace, the polar opposite of her brother Gerald's. She too has often been named as one of the conspirators against him, but again, no evidence of foul play has ever been uncovered. On the topic of succession, Comstar was also undergoing changes to bring it more in line with Raymond Karpov's vision for a technocratic secret society. The Doctrinal Edict of 2861 had given the Primus the power to name a chosen successor, as well as formalize the stratified organizational hierarchy. At the bottom were the acolytes, then adepts and precentors above them. All other legacy roles were phased out. The First Circuit, which had expanded to 10 members back in 2857, remained the ruling council, answering only to the Primus. The militant ROM continued to expand, especially following the Vedder affair. Loki agent Rosemary Vedder had infiltrated Comstar 3 years prior and rose to the rank of adept, sending highly classified intel back to the Commonwealth during that time. More than 36 other foreign agents in lower positions were discovered after the crackdown. Kurita's company store policy, their insidious plan to trap mercenaries in inescapable debt, leaving them no option but to sell off their unit and sign up as regulars, had netted them a number of cheap acquisitions over the decades. Despite their growing reputation for underhandedness, it did not deter others from signing up with the successor state, such as the Eisengrim in 2861. Another of their recent acquisitions had been the 12th Starguard just 3 years prior, but already there had been problems. The Ratfrags, one of the regiments within the mercenary brigade, had broken contract the previous year, citing a lack of payment. Tensions only escalated from there, until in 2861, the entire Starguard mutinied and returned to the Lyran Commonwealth, robbing Kurita of that same strength they had been so pleased to acquire. If there is a lesson to be learned, it is that once a mercenary command has reached sufficient size, it can be almost impossible to stop them from leaving if that's what they want to do. This loss did not deter them, however, and the consensus within the DCMS is that the company store program has been a net positive for the military. With Kurita still firm advocates of the policy to the present day 3025, it remains to be seen whether this will cause issues for them again in the future. The Federated Suns juggernaut began moving again in 2861, this time with a greater focus on the St. Ives commonality. The 2 planets they had lost to Jade Castle were welcomed back into the Federated Suns, and another 5 border systems were added to the Capellan March. Daymar Liao seemed incapable of organising any sort of defence. By the mid-year, Michael Davian signed off on a bold plan to bring the war to a decisive end. a pair of daring raids were to be carried out by two of the best units within the AFFS, the 7th Cruises Lancers and Davian Assault Guards. Both understood that this could be a one-way trip. MIIO intelligence placed the Chancellor in one of two locations, Cyan or St. Ives. Making use of uncolonized systems, they would journey to their targets and attempt to take Dainmar hostage. The deeper of the two strikes took place first, shocking the Confederation that their enemy could reach their capital unopposed. It was the first time since Kurita had carried out skirmishing airspace raids in the New Avalon system that a successor state capital had been targeted, and not since the famous Tamar Tigers raided Luthien back in the opening months of the First Succession War had troops made landfall. The Crucis Lancers did not find their quarry and promptly departed before the overwhelming Capellan forces could corner them. On July 5th, the Davian Guards arrived at St. Ives aboard FSS Resolve. Leading them in this reckless action was Michael's own daughter, Melissa Davian. Splitting her forces, she held back the Chancellor's personal guard while the rest of her regiment rained fire on the Liao Palace where Dainmar was sheltering. The Chancellor's only hope was that the Capellan Hussars could break through before the assault guards breached his bunker. They very nearly did when they isolated Melissa from the rest of her unit, but before they could capitalize, Lieutenant Colonel Zolanda Dugan charged their position. She gave her life to ensure the safety of the Davian air, one of only 2 mechs the AFFS lost during the mission. Though the assault guards were driven back from the Chancellor's palace, Dainmar was so shaken that he dispatched a messenger to New Avalon in order to discuss terms for a ceasefire. The First Prince was caught off guard by the Liao proposal. He wisely held off issuing a response until after the Winter Garden attack scheduled for January 2862 had gone ahead, netting 2 more easy victories. But after a Capellan raid hit Redfield, he saw that the time was right to send a reply. His starting point in the negotiations was a demand that he knew no successor lord could possibly accept. He wanted the Capellan government to recognize Federated Sun's authority over not just the Winter Garden conquests, but every system that had changed hands since the fall of the Star League. Dainmar agreed at once, handing Michael a shocking political victory. The peace agreement brought the Second Succession War to an end for the worlds along the Davian-Liao border. With their flanks secure, the Federated Suns began redeploying their entire military to face off against the Draconis Combine. The DCMS were racing to take what they could from the Commonwealth before the Rimwood threat grew too great to continue. With aid from the Nightmare's Merc unit, Al-Hilla and Kabbalah fell to the Dragon, but on October 19th, Coordinator Miyogi Kurita called a halt to all military operations. The supply situation was critical for many of their frontline units, and an attack on Emporia staged by the Razelhaig regulars had to be abandoned. Steiner's other border was still under threat in 2862, as Magrez yet again became the site of a battle. The Eredani Light Horse returned to capture Ilion, but there had been so much destruction wrought on that planet that it was virtually uninhabited by war's end. Soon after, Captain General Philippa Marek also ordered her troops to cease combat operations, after agreeing to an armistice between her family and Steiner's, though not necessarily their states. Philippa's reasons for calling for peace were more than just appeasing her parliament and the sentiment of her people. Despite the humiliating terms Dainmar Liao had agreed to with Davian, his military could now at least focus on the Freewells League. The newest regiment of the Chesterton Reserves landed on Ling and began to lay waste to any targets of opportunity. Efforts by the Orloff Grenadiers to drive them off ended in disaster. Only after the Fusiliers seized a great wealth of spare parts for themselves did they depart. By the dawn of 2863, it was clear that the war was winding down. The final moves came in the vicinity of Terra. The Marek militia were already risking the tenuous ceasefire with Steiner when they launched a raid on Kalasson, while a larger Leal task force took control of the capital of the Syrian Concordance. The Federation of Sky were able to seize control of 2 more systems from the Kuzu prefecture. The very last gasp of the Second Succession War came in October 2863, when the famed stealths led a counterattack against the Kuritan occupation of Sakhalin. Control of the fabled unit had passed to Raymond Winfield, with the 2nd Battalion under the command of former starlet Angela Franks, the famous Black Pearl. The Combine's new defensive posture served them well, inflicting heavy casualties on the stealths. A flanking attack nearly destroyed the unit outright, but Franks intervened at a crucial moment, stopping the advance almost single-handedly. It cost Angela her life when the enemy landed a hit on our cockpit that took the head of our battlemaster clean off. As the enemy mechs advanced on our retreating unit, the Black Pearl seemingly returned from beyond the grave to fire one more weapon salvo, killing the Kuritan commander, causing the DCMS to rout. Sakhalin was secure, as was Angela Frank's legacy. The stealths would ultimately be disbanded for the final time after their victory on Sakhalin, passing into legend themselves. Winfield was made Duke of Treeline, and the planet was later renamed after him. His descendants today lead an LCAF regiment that maintains many of the traditions and combat doctrine of their ancestors, operating out of a planet which had once belonged to the Rimworld's Republic that had first birthed the stealths. With this battle's conclusion, operations came to a halt along all the successor state borders. By December 2863, few of the great houses had managed to reach an agreement or sign an official ceasefire, but for all intents and purposes, the Second Succession War was over. After more than 35 relentless years of carnage, the Second Succession War finally ran out of steam in 2863, grinding to a shuddering halt along all fronts. Just as was the case with its predecessor before, this did not happen because of any strong desire for peace, but simply because the great houses could no longer muster enough strength to wage war on one another. As soon as the firing stopped, aid and recovery teams were dispatched to the frontier worlds who had again been scarred by the depredations of war. For many, it was already too late. Though fewer planets have been subjected to orbital bombardments or mass WMD use, for those colonies that were hanging on by a thread after the first conflict, the commencement of the Second Succession War so soon after ruined any slim chance of survival. Since 2830, another 218 systems were abandoned or had their populations completely eradicated, and only 2 new colonies had been founded by people fleeing to the periphery. Just as had happened before, the worlds lying outside the inner sphere were not spared the horrors of the Succession Wars, despite taking no part in the fighting, as almost half of those abandoned planets had been part of the periphery. Most sources shy away from giving an estimate for the total number of casualties sustained during the Second Succession War, due to the complications with determining which of the 2 post-Starleague conflicts are to blame for the countless people who died of starvation or disease. What little consensus there is tends to settle on a loose hundreds of millions dead, though how high that goes is anyone's guess. The number of people wounded or displaced is surely in the billions. However obscene the death toll might have been, it was insignificant compared to the First Succession War, and so those in power were able to disregard it with worrying ease. They were more interested in seeing what several generations of bloody conquest had won them. It's difficult to imagine that any were excited by the reports that soon crossed their desks. Even those who had managed to take and hold foreign lands had to face the reality that many planets had been rendered worthless by the fighting. Coupled with the interior worlds now abandoned and the loss of advanced technology they had all suffered, they found precious little to celebrate. Rather than touting any great victories to their people, the successor lords simply claimed that vanquishing their enemies was justification enough for so many lives spent, and would likely be the cause for resuming the conflict in the future. For as little as the balance in power between the great houses shifted during the early succession wars, the Inner Sphere had nonetheless undergone some significant changes in its borders in the 100 years since the Stalag Civil War began. For starters, several states no longer existed. The Terran hegemony had at one time been a star empire of 125 systems, not counting the many shared worlds or periphery outposts. The last vestige of that government, Comstar, held only Terra. The Rimworld's Republic had colonized 245 systems, but lost 86 to Steiner's Operation Olmerich, a defeat which ultimately brought down the government. Of the Forsaken Worlds, only 68 had managed to eke out a living, including the reborn Oberon Confederation. The rest had either evacuated or starved. The other periphery realms had not been encroached upon by the Inner Sphere, but had nonetheless been forced to abandon several of their colonies. The Magistracy of Canopus and Taurian Concordat had lost 13 each, while the Outworlds Alliance had lost 62. They may have settled one new world, but 8 others had broken away to form their own microstate. Unfortunately, going it alone proved too great a challenge for Trader's Domain, and the fragile alliance would dissolve towards the end of the century. Of the successor states themselves, if any can be considered winners of the last 100 years of conflict, the most likely candidate is the Draconis Combine. They were the only realm to have expanded in both directions, establishing large salients into both of their rivals by the end of the Second Succession War. Reviewing the individual military districts, Benjamin and Razelhaig had both done well, losing almost nothing while making significant gains. Dieron had initially grown dramatically as it absorbed large chunks of the Terran hegemony, but more recently had been losing ground to all 3 of its neighbours. Galadon had seen some changes, but a balance was more or less maintained, whereas the only shift in Pesht had been those systems abandoned over the course of the war. Going from the strongest to the weakest, the Capellan Confederation was unquestionably the biggest loser so far. It had been steadily squeezed by both of its neighbours, and had almost no major successes on the battlefield. Tikhonov may have expanded coreward into the old Terran hegemony, but the Free Worlds had pressed inwards, and any gains against the Federated Suns reversed. Sana reclaimed part of Kenyan Marik salient, but Davian had taken a large chunk out of the Spinward side of the region, as they had for the Capella, Cyan and St. Ives commonalities too. The Free Worlds border had been very dynamic during the Second Succession War, but by the end of the conflict, the situation had more or less reset. Worst affected was Andurian, a region of space that Liao had seemingly only managed to retain control of thanks to the Starleague Accords. It and the small Chesterton commonality would soon disappear altogether. The Lyran Commonwealth had mixed fortunes in the early succession wars. Before they had begun, Steiner had taken more territory during Operation Olmerich than any other realm had managed since. Similar gains were made from the collapsing Terran hegemony. The first war had seen the Bolan Thumb more or less reclaimed, and the job was finished in the second. They had steadily given ground to the Caritans, but had still achieved some victories on that front. The Federation of Sky had proven itself a formidable bastion in the face of aggression from both major enemies, and even the Federated Suns. They were the only province to beat back the Draconis Combine. The Tamar Pact, by contrast, had suffered greatly, and their capital was now perilously close to the border. A Curitan salient had forced them to cede control of the rimward tip of their province to House Lestrade. The Protectorate of Donegal, safely removed from the most dangerous foe, could boast about their strong performances, having gained far more along the rimward flank than they had lost. In 2837, the Freewills League had undergone a hard reset to their Succession War progress when the Captain General recalled all his forces from foreign territory in the wake of Comstar's communications interdiction. The hurt kept coming for them over the next 5 years, but they managed nonetheless to make a remarkable recovery by winning back most of those systems in the last 2 decades. The minor provinces in the Terran region had not fared so well. Both the Duchy of Kalidasa and Border Protectorate had been overrun in the First and Second Wars respectively. The Syrian Concordance had also lost its capital. The Marik Commonwealth had unexpectedly found itself on the front lines at one point, but managed to pull through. The Rim and Stuart commonalities had weathered the storm, as had the other minor provinces, Abbey District, Duchies of Graham, Marik and Tamarind, Principality of Gibson, and Regulum Free States. The Principality of Regulus may have avoided any actual conflict, but not so political fights, which saw it lose ground to its Corwood rival. The Grand Duchy of Oriente, who had shifted from the control of one noble house to another, and their vassal Duchy of Orloff, had managed to hold the line in the face of determined Liao assaults, but otherwise had achieved little. This was not so for the Duchy of Andurian, who despite losing several systems to independence movements, had undergone greater expansion than any other province of the Freewills League. The Federated Sons had an extremely tough time of things in the First Succession War, but against all odds had managed to recover most of its territory by war's end. Looking only at the second though, it's a completely different story. They had the best performance of any great house in terms of systems taken. The Draconis March, now based out of the old capital at Tancredi IV, had been one of the most dynamic fronts of the war. In the Woodbine operational area, they had achieved some limited success, pushing up along the Outworlds Alliance border. At the other end, in the new Exeter operational area, they had managed to re-establish a vital Terran corridor. Their most notable loss came at Robinson, where the Kuritans sowed devastation using their full range of WMDs. The planet was still under occupation, and Davion was already working on plans to recover it. The Crucis March underwent no significant changes, save for the near disaster back in 2796. Paul Davion's reformation would hopefully ensure such a situation would never occur again. But the greatest change had come along the Capellan March border. Both the Cathal and New Syrtis operational areas had proven almost unstoppable as they expanded into Liao territory. These victories were tinged with an element of defeat. That region of space had been particularly scarred during the Second Succession War. As the enemy withdrew, they conducted a scorched earth policy, dooming any chances of survival for those left behind. While the common citizens held out hope that the fragile peace would last, and the nobility and politicians wished for time to incorporate their new territory into the realm, for the military leaders of the Inner Sphere who could not see beyond their next battle, all they cared about was the condition of their forces and how soon they might be able to launch the next attack, or might expect one coming their way. Even a cursory glance at the 2864 figures makes it clear just how abysmal the situation had become. Understanding the sorry state of affairs on the front line leaves no questions as to why the Successor Lords had been forced to seek a peace, regardless of their own personal leanings. Not since before the Age of War, when they were still proto-states huddling around the Terran hegemony, did the various armed forces of the Inner Sphere have such little available manpower and materiel. Furthermore, the warships that once threatened devastation on any world were now completely extinct. Throughout this series, we have highlighted whenever a battlemech regiment was destroyed in combat, but significant gaps in our knowledge paint a false picture. While we can be relatively accurate in pinpointing the moment at which the majority of Liao and Marik losses happened, the date of destruction for half of Davion's and 3/4 of Kurita and Steiner's mech casualties are unknown. Removing those from our map based on recorded 2864 deployments gives us our first accurate snapshot of the Ionosphere militaries since the start of the war. There is a common misbelief that the 31st century militaries are weaker than at any prior point in the history of the successor states. While it is true that technological sophistication has continued to decline over the past century and a half, the great houses have actually been gradually rebuilding their strength in the years since their true nadir at the conclusion of the Second Succession War. Beginning with the Draconis Combine mustered soldiery, who at one time had been the preeminent power among the successor states, they had dropped from a high of equivalent strength to over 147 battlemech regiments to under 119 by the time the Second War began, and continued to plummet down to less than 36. On paper, they had 92 regiments, but those had an average readiness level of just 40%. Some have described the Liao realm as the sick man of the Ionosphere. If there was a point at which they ceased to be on par with the other great houses, it was the Second Succession War. Back in 2786, the humble Capellan Confederation armed forces could field a respectable 118 mech regiments. The rebuilding effort after the First Succession War had brought them back to almost 92. By 2864, if they were to condense what materiel they had left, they could barely scrape together 21 units. On paper, they could still call on 51 regiments with an average strength of 42%, but with such a paltry offering available, their reduction in territory was perhaps a blessing in disguise when it came to defence. The Lyran Commonwealth Armed Forces began the First War with 120 factory fresh battlemech regiments, and had recovered to more or less that same number, albeit in a much sorrier state of repair. The Second Succession War had highlighted their poor condition, and they could now call on just 35 regiments worth of mechs. A 44% average strength put their 78 listed units slightly above the Ionosphere norm. The Freewells League military had begun with ever so slightly less, around 119 regiments worth. They began the second conflict with just over 93, but now they too couldn't even field 35 if they were to consolidate what mechs remained to them. With a readiness rating of almost 49%, the 72 battlemech regiments were in a fantastic shape for the era. All of them were no doubt raring to go. Perhaps that's what some of the most delusional among their command structure were saying. The armed forces of the Federated Suns was the only realm to get close to the Combine in 2786, but they had taken a far greater beating in that first war, dropping from a high of 140 mech regiments in strength to just over 100 by the time the second began. Better successes in that later conflict meant that they had closed the gap to their rivals. All of their battlemechs combined now amassed to just under 35 units. Their rolls still optimistically listed 81 regiments, plus one additional battalion, which together had a combat effectiveness of roughly 43%. For the sake of completeness, we'll mention now that the periphery militaries had declined just as their Ionosphere counterparts had. There was no realistic chance of them ever recovering to their Reunification War era figures or challenging the great houses. The technological and societal decay was as complete there as everywhere else. Mercenaries had seen their importance grow over the 80 years since Kerensky's departure. Though they had been as much victims of the war as everyone else had, their casualties were offset by an ever-increasing number of them. In 2786, they had accounted for less than 6% of the battlemech numbers across human space. By 2864, that figure had risen to over 15% and has continued to increase in the modern era. And that's only counting those units large enough to field at least a battalion. There are an uncountable number of smaller mercenary bands that field a company or less that don't make it into our figures. In contrast to the First Succession War, few formal peace agreements were reached by the warring parties. Only the humiliating concessions made by Danemar Liao and a limited restriction between Marek and Steiner that they would not target the other family's members held back the tide. Naturally, there was a desire by many to foster a stronger state of harmony, and that charge was led by the young Archon Elizabeth Steiner. Among her immediate neighbours, she found a like-minded individual in Philippa Marek, but Michael Davian was also amenable to talks. On November 9, 2864, an army of diplomats and civil servants from across the Inner Sphere converged on New Earth, hoping to formally agree an end to the succession wars. The peace talks could not have gotten off to a more inauspicious start. The Draconis Combine ambassador loudly declared that they had no intention of agreeing to a peace, nor did they even have the authority to discuss terms. They were simply there to observe proceedings. James Marek, the Freewells League ambassador, did not share his mother's temperament, losing Steiner the support she was sorely counting on. First Prince Michael Davian had tasked the Federated Sons ambassador, Luther Davian, with getting the others to agree to name him First Lord of the Star League. Such demands had sparked the succession wars in the first place, and were counter to everything Steiner was trying to achieve at New Earth. Lastly, the Capellan ambassador would not accept peace until all worlds taken by their neighbour states were returned to the Confederation, an impossible request. After 7 weeks of stalled talks, the participants threw up their hands in defeat. Each would return to their realm with news that no peace could be agreed, thus ensuring that a third succession war was all but inevitable. The Kuritan delegate would not even make it that far. He was arrested by the Lyran Intelligence Corps and executed as a spy. There was, of course, one other major faction involved in the Second Succession War, the one who had instigated the entire conflict in the first place, Comstar. Despite some missteps along the way, for them it had been a tremendous success. Jerome Blake's death set the ball in motion, and his successor Konrad Toyama had worked tirelessly to see his plans unfold on the grand stage. The Order had undergone a dramatic transformation following Raymond Karpov's takeover, to the point where it is almost unrecognizable to the Comstar of Blake's day. The debate continues as to how much of the fanaticism that became a hallmark of the Comstar Order was intended by Jerome when he first concocted the idea. What little we know suggests he only intended to use religion as a means to ensure his organization's survival. Operation Holy Shroud seems to conflict with his stated desires. Regardless, it is beyond question that Comstar's strength grew considerably over the course of the war. For them, the slaughter unleashed by the Great Houses had brought them one step closer to achieving their destiny. Their influence over the successor states had grown substantially, to the point where they were almost unchallengeable, and this trend seemed sure to continue. It could be argued that Raymond Karpov was the single most powerful person in existence at that point, puppet master to the petty successor lords, a man who could bend them to his own will. With him at the reins, Blessed Blake's vision of Comstar leading humanity into a new golden age would surely come true.